Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Welcome back, and continuing the discussion on certainty. So, last episode, I started to argue against the idea that there's anything we can be 100% certain about. So I'm very much continuing that discussion, even though I'll be sort of talking about it from a slightly different angle, significantly different angle. Nonetheless, I'm not going to sort of go over the basics again. So if you were just sort of jumping in now, I do recommend check out the last episode about knowledge and experience, so that you have full background on what I'm talking about now. So I covered I covered the idea that, well, we're certain of what our immediate experience is. And I made some cases for why I think that we actually should allow for a little bit of doubt about what our immediate experience is. The other kind of claim that people often make about that they say, well, yeah, about that I'm 100% certain, tends to be claims that are roughly of a logical kind. So that's what I'm going to address today. Those, I think, can be roughly split up into two kinds. Claims about the fundamental laws of logic and claims about analytic statements. Analytic statements being statements where nothing is really being said. Everything is already included in the meanings of the words. So, the classic example is bachelors are unmarried men, right? That kind of a statement, all it's doing is explaining what's already implicit in the meanings of the word. So that's something we should be able to be certain about. So the idea goes. Now I'm going to address the laws of logic version of this first. Okay. So, and I think when people say, so I've encountered this, and people who sort of say, well, the basic laws of logic are things we can be certain about. And I think when people say this, they're roughly in one of two camps. Either they're somewhat familiar with basic propositional logic, first order logic, what people call classical logic. And they're sort of saying, whatever is absolutely true in that system, we can be certain about. Or they're not so much in this sort of contemporary logical tradition, but they're thinking more, they're thinking on a sort of bigger perspective. They're thinking just logic generally is something that has laws, and we can be certain about those. And maybe, there's a certain affinity there with Aristotle, right? Like Aristotle established the very fundamental basic laws of logic. Whatever's gone on since then, I don't care too much about it, but at least those basic laws of Aristotle we should be sure about. So I want to say a couple of things just about that whole disambiguation that I just introduced. Classical logic and Aristotelian syllogistic logic are obviously not the same thing. In fact, so one, classical logic is a lot more powerful than Aristotelian syllogistic logic, and they don't always agree, right? So, for example, in classical logic, from inconsistent premises, right, from a contradiction, you can prove anything. Whereas that's not the case in syllogistic logic. That in syllogistic logic, if you have inconsistent premises, then nothing's going to follow from that. There's also there's at least one syllogistic mode that is valid in syllogistic logic that's invalid in classical logic. That has to do with this thing called the existential import. I don't really want to go into that here, but just to make the point that what people have in mind when they say sort of basic logic is actually something that could be any number of things, and they don't always agree. Now, having said that, let me sort of narrow down all the complications involved by focusing in on the three classical laws of logic, right? So on this, classical logic and syllogistic logic do agree, right? The three basic laws are the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, and the law of identity. These, introduced by Aristotle, still going to hold in classical logic. And so I think a lot of times that is what people have in mind when they're sort of appealing to logic for a claim to certainty. So let me actually go through those and see why there's reasons to doubt all three. So starting with the law of excluded middle. What the law of excluded middle says is that essentially that P or not P is always true for any given proposition P. So to say that sort of less formally, it's always true that some proposition, whatever the proposition is either true or false. That or statement is itself always true. That's the law of excluded middle, right? And roughly, it's called excluded middle as in there's no third way, there's no third option, right? Either if this really is a proposition, then either it's true or it's false. There is no neither. So I think there are definitely, this is fairly easy to call into question. So I'll run through some reasons why. First, most obvious reason is if you have a non-referring term in your proposition. So let's say the most famous example of this is the present king of France is bald, right? So there is no present king of France. So what this proposition is about is actually this thing that doesn't exist. And so, is that statement true or false? The present king of France is bald. It's certainly not true. There is no present king of France. But is it false? I mean, no, right? It seems to actually be neither because there just is no present king of France. Now, it might seem weird that I'm using this example because actually Bertrand Russell uses this example to make the case that actually, if you analyze the sentence properly, then it does have a truth value. Okay, so what Russell says is, what this statement, the present king of France is bald, is saying, really, is there exists a present king of France, and he is bald. And so that's obviously false, right? There is no present king of France, and so problem averted. We got a truth value. It's false. So I think pretty intuitively, Russell's analysis isn't really quite right. So when I say the present king of France is bald, I am not asserting that the present king of France exists. I am presupposing it. And there's a difference between asserting something and presupposing it. I am asserting that the present king of France, whatever that is bald. But I'm not asserting that he exists, right? I'm merely referring to something that I guess I presume exists, but I'm not actually saying that. So I actually think that his analysis, while it would solve the problem, is not actually a great analysis of how we actually use language, right? Of how, of what a phrase, the present king of France is bald, actually means when we use it in natural language. So I don't think his way out is really all that simple. I think the problem of non-referring terms in propositions is a reason to accept that there are propositions that are in fact propositions and yet are not going to be true or false. So another case is vague predicates. Okay, so this gets into the Sorites paradox, which I've mentioned a couple of times. So I'll go through it briefly, right? Am I bald? Well, I have to shave soon. So right now, I'm probably not that borderline a case. I think I'm pretty clearly not bald. But normally, I think I'm pretty close. I'm something like a borderline case of bald. And so the statement, I'm bald, might not be true or false, right? I mean, there's other ways you could deal with that. But, what goes on with these vague predicates is if you want to say for all people, all cases, yes, either they're bald or they're not bald, then there's going to have to be this exact boundary point. which seems really, really counterintuitive. So, it just seems like, it just seems kind of intuitive to think that, no, that's actually not what's going on. There are these sort of borderline cases. Going along with those, with that, so what I just explained is it gives you a reason to think that there are some cases where true and false are not going to apply. A popular solution to the vagueness problem is to use what's been called fuzzy logic. So fuzzy logic is basically a kind of logic where your truth values actually come in degrees. So rather than saying true or false, or even true or false or neither, what you actually is, you have a spectrum between 0 is false, 100% false, 1 is true, 100% true, and you have the whole continuum of the real numbers from 0 to 1, which stand for kind of ordered degrees of truth. Okay? So, for example, you might say that whatever amount of bald I am, I'm obviously more bald than some people, less bald than other people, right? So maybe the right way to say it is that the truth value of my baldness is, something, right? It is like something like whatever, 0.4 between 0 and 1, and people who are 0.5 bald are balder than I am, and people who are 0.2 bald are less bald than I am. That seems to conform pretty well to our intuitions about the fact that things work by degrees, and that, there are cases where something sort of applies more than other things, doesn't fully apply, but kind of applies, right? So all of this is just to make that point that just the existence of vague predicates and vague situations really does seem to suggest that the law of excluded middle will not always hold. One more example to give, the problem of future contingents. So this one is really interesting because this is Aristotle who proposed this problem himself. Now, Aristotle is the one who introduced these three basic laws of logic, so he's the one who argues for the law of excluded middle. And yet, in this famous chapter 9 on interpretation, he proposes this problem of future contingents, right? So it's this problem of this sea battle that's going to happen in the future. Now, let's say that I say some sea battle is going to happen 3 years from now, right? Well, his point is whether that's true or false. If it's true or false now, then we've implied a determinism, right? And then we have no free will, and we have all the kind of problems that come along with that, right? And so it can't actually be the case that claims about the future are, as of right now, true or false. And so he solves this problem by actually saying they are neither, right? So he himself proposes these future contingents as exceptions to the law of excluded middle. There's maybe other ways you can get around that, but I think the previous reasons that I gave I think are stronger for reasons to think, we don't have to accept that the law of excluded middle is something universal. Now, okay, moving on to the law of non-contradiction. This one might seem maybe a little bit harder to accept. A little bit harder to reject. Although, in my opinion, not really that hard to reject. First thing to point out is that if you, in classical logic, if you deny excluded middle, right? So if you say not the case that P or not P, by an application of DeMorgan's law, of one of DeMorgan's laws, which is a very sort of fundamental and very, very intuitive, very simple transformation you make in classical logic, you get not P and not P, which the two nots cancel out, and so you get not P and P. In other words, you get a contradiction, right? So if you deny the law of if you deny excluded middle, that's equivalent to accepting contradiction in classical logic. So there are, again, maybe you might have reasons for denying this particular application of DeMorgan's law, or for denying DeMorgan's law in certain cases. But just right off the bat, if the thought was, well, okay, maybe there's exceptions to excluded middle, there's not going to be exceptions to non-contradiction, right away there's a problem with that, because in classical logic, they actually end up being, equivalent. Denying excluded middle and accepting a contradiction ends up being equivalent. Now, putting that aside, again, there might be ways you might get around that. What are some actual reasons to think that that the law of non-contradiction isn't universal? Well, first, a really obvious example, the legal case. I talked about the legal example, I think, in the very first episode. But let me quickly run through it again. This is like my version of it, but you could have different versions of it. But here's a simple one. The law says that if so and so, if anybody dies, their property will go to the oldest living offspring in all cases. No matter who you are or what the circumstances, if you die, your property goes to your oldest living offspring. There's another law that says if you were a convict, then you can't have property. And now, so now we have a situation where somebody dies, their oldest living offspring is a convict, right? So the law basically says that oldest living offspring, who is a convict, both must and must not inherit the property of the dead person. So obviously what happened, right? Whoever designed this law didn't account for the fact that this might happen. And so the law is actually yielding a contradictory result. Okay? So we've got a contradiction, right? And then, how you deal with it is how you deal with it. But just in the realm of what the law itself says, we've been handed a contradiction. Okay, so here is a place, just in terms of what the law says, where the law of non-contradiction doesn't apply. Now, there's a temptation to say, well, that's about the law. That's not really about the world. But, there's no limitations about what the laws of logic can apply to, right? The laws of logic, in one sense, they can just be used to describe situations. And so, or let's say formal, logical languages can be used to just describe situations. So this legal situation can just be described as a contradiction. And of course, you can also have ethical cases that are kind of like this as well, where, you have some ethical rule saying in such a circumstance you must do this, and another ethical rule saying in this kind of circumstance you can't do that. And, there's many examples like that. I don't think it's worth going into the details. It'll play out more or less like this legal example. Okay, now, next kind of case for denying the law of non-contradiction, the liar paradox. Okay, so I've done 2 episodes on the liar paradox before, so I don't want to go into too much detail here again, but basically, liar paradox, we all know and love. This statement is false. If it's true, it must be false. If it's false, it must be true. Obviously, there's tons and tons of literature on the liar paradox. There are a whole number of proposed solutions. The case I want to make here is simply accepting that the sentence is contradictory, that is to say that it is in fact both true and false, is probably the simplest solution, right? Like that actually just is what the paradox is. The paradox just is that the sentence is both true and false. If we were willing to just accept that and modify our logic so that is okay, right? That doesn't mean we can prove anything or lead to any kind of crazy other results, so long as that can be kind of contained in the logic, so that we're okay having a contradiction, then, this weird self-referential abstract sentence that doesn't really seem to even be, isn't talking about anything other than itself. So it's contradictory, big deal. So I want to say that that's, intuitively, at least the simplest solution we can get. Now, I think that to look at the most obvious other solutions, right? There's the solution that says, well, the sentence is meaningless. It's not actually saying anything. I think that and usually, and so the why would somebody say that it's not saying anything? Well, it's self-referential, right? It's not actually about anything other than itself. Okay, well, what about sentences like this sentence is in English, which is obviously true. This sentence has 5 words, which is true. There's so many examples. I mean, you can, go online and read an article and just find somebody just in passing make a reference to the article itself, and you know exactly what they're talking about. So to say that that's meaningless is to say that meaning is something other than what happens when we very clearly understand what is being said. So that seems like a way bigger, like a way harder sort of pill to swallow than just accepting that in this, weird situation of this self-referential sentence, it's just both true and false. The other obvious solution is to say that the sentence is neither true nor false. So, it's to kind of go excluded middle instead of contradiction. The problem with that is the so-called revenge liar, right? So, if you have, instead of this statement is false, you say the statement is not true, then okay, if you try to solve that by saying it's neither true nor false, then, well, all it's saying is that it's not true. It's no longer saying that it's false. It's just saying it's not true. So if it's neither true nor false, if it's saying it's not true, then it must be true. And we're back. So that's a really tough problem for the gappy approach, for the approach that says, it's neither. So again, people have proposed ways out, but they get pretty complicated. So I think, again, that at least the simplest possible solution, not necessarily the correct one at the end of the day, but the simplest is to just accept the contradiction. Now, moving on. One more case of denying the law of non-contradiction. Zeno's arrow. Okay, so unfortunately, I haven't done any episodes on Zeno's paradoxes yet. I will get to that at some point because I love them dearly, obviously. For those listening and not watching, I said obviously because I have a painting of Achilles and the tortoise behind me. Zeno's arrow is this problem that basically goes as follows. If you take a snapshot of an arrow in motion, right? By a snapshot, I mean a kind of an instant. Right? At that instant, it's static, right? It's only in one place. Let's not say static. Let's say it's only in one place at that instant, right? So now let's take these sort of snapshots at all of the instants along this arrow's trajectory. At any one of those instants, it's only exactly where it is, which means in only one place, right? So if all of these instants that it sort of passes through as it's going through time actually exhaust the time in which the arrow exists as it's moving, and it is in only one place in all of those instances, you can ask, when does the traveling actually happen, right? The arrow is in only one place at each one of these instances. Where does the actual movement come in? And one possible solution to this problem is to say simply that actually at every one of those instances, the arrow, even though it is only in one place, is actually in motion. In other words, it's both in motion and not in motion at every one of those instances. Now that might not seem like a very appealing solution. I don't find it an especially appealing solution, but it is a troubling problem, right? I think it's actually a fairly fundamental issue with our conception of time, right? So time is supposed to be composed of these instants that have no time in of themselves, right? They're kind of like I said last time about when I was talking about time in part 1 of this episode. Time is, instants in time are really like these are like coordinates that don't take up any time themselves. They just sort of mark a point between the past and the past and the future. If these instants have no amount of time themselves, how does their succession end up with time actually moving forward, right? And I think the idea is that time moves forward in infinitesimal increments, right? So as it moves forward by, let's say, amounts that are not zero, but also are not actually substantial. This, I think, basically, to get even more fundamental, the problem is that time, because if it's conceived as continuous, is conceived as this thing that's infinitely divisible, right? So if you take an instant in time and say, well, what's the next instant? Whatever you pick, there's actually an infinite amount of instants in between those two, right? So there is never, for any given instant, there is never a distinct next instant, right? There will always be an infinite amount of instants in between whatever one you want to say is next. That in itself already seems contradictory, right? At the very least, it's really, really hard to intuitively wrap your head around. It almost seems incoherent. And that is actually our intuitive conception of time. So it seems like it's very possible to think that, a contradiction is involved in just the very basic ideas of how we think about time. You could say, of course, that time instead is discrete, right? But that is also extremely counterintuitive, right? If time comes in these little chunks that you can't divide, the obvious question is, why can't you divide them, right? If there's actual positive amount of time in one of these units, why can't we even just conceptually divide that into two parts? Let me take a pause here for a moment. Again, if going so far, right, I've talked about the Law of Excluded Middle and Law of Non-Contradiction, and I think I've made, by all the points that I've sort of put together cumulatively, I think we have reason to doubt both of those, at least a little bit. Let me move on now to I think the toughest one, the law of identity. The toughest one to think that we could have an exception for, the toughest one to think that it's not a universal law. But again, I think there are actually very good reasons to doubt it. So reason number one, identity over time. So you may have heard of the thought experiment of Theseus' ship, right? So ship goes out, and as it's moving across the ocean, the people who work on the ship are fixing it as they go. They replace one plank over here, one plank over there. By the time the ship reaches its destination, the ship is actually made up of entirely new actual material. Is it the same ship? If not, at what point did it switch? If we now take all of the material that used to be that ship and now make a new ship, is that ship the same as the old ship? You can ask all kinds of questions like this, and there are no clear answers. You can stipulate clear answers, but there's always sort of intuitive problems with any given solution. And actually, the problem becomes more fundamental, right? The problem at its most fundamental level is, if we're going through time, then something is changing. And if something is changing, in what does its sameness consist, right? If something is now not exactly the same as it was before, why is it actually the same thing at all? How can we account for change in something still being the same thing? Given that, if enough change happens, then it won't be the same thing. So this, kind of throws just a simple wedge in our idea of identity. Now, let's say, okay, fine. So there's doubt there. Let's put that aside. What about just identity within an instant in time? Forget diachronic, identity. Forget identity across time. And let's just talk about identity in an instant. Okay. So even in an instant, we get problems. One problem is similar to one that I talked about last time, which is the fact that an instant, and it's something I was just talking about when talking about Zeno's arrow, is that an instant, again, is actually not, has no content, right? It's actually not any amount of time itself. And so one way you might put why this is a problem is that for any given object at an instant, here's one way you could put it. It's like it doesn't get any time to actually be what it is, right? At any given instant, what is happening to an object? It's instantaneously moving to the next instant where some small change has happened and it is now something slightly different. Okay? So if we're talking about strict identity, what people call numerical identity, which means everything's exactly the same. Well, from one instant to the next, something has changed. And so from one instant, so at any given instant, what is an object doing? Well, it's basically instantaneously becoming what it's going to become at the very next instant. And so it's like objects don't have any positive amount of time to actually be what they are. That may or may not seem like a problem. It seems like a problem to me, but if you want to say, I don't see the problem, so they're instantaneously becoming something else, so what? At the end instant, they're still whatever they are, and that is what they are, so we still have identity. I think that's fine. I wanted to raise this one because I think there might be a problem there, but if you don't want to accept that one, I understand that it may seem like a fairly easy one to get out of. There are a few others that I think are significantly harder. So there's the mereological problem. So mereology, study of like the relationship of parts to wholes. Here you get some really interesting problems. So here's a problem, I think, given by a philosopher named Wiggins. And you have a cat on a mat. Cat's name's Tibbles. So far, so good. We've got a cat named Tibbles. Now, for any given object, objects have parts, right? So, and we have to give existence and identity to those parts, right? So, I am a person, but I also have a head, and that head itself is an actual object, and identity applies to my head just as much as it applies to all of me. So same with Tibbles, right? Tibbles is a cat and is an object, and identity applies. Now, Tibbles also has parts. One of Tibbles' parts is what's called Tibbles' tail complement. Okay, so it's the part of Tibbles that encompasses all of Tibbles except the tail. So if you follow me here, we've got Tibbles who has a part of him, let's say, I guess Tibbles is a boy cat, him, and that part is all of him except the tail. And so let's call this tail complement Tib. Okay, so Tibbles and Tib are not identical. They're not the same. One of them has a tail, one of them doesn't. Now, let's say that we, in order to make an extremely abstract philosophical point, cut off Tibbles' tail. Now Tibbles and Tib are actually identical, okay? Physically. However, they're not entirely identical in the sense that not everything that you could say about one of them, you can say about the other. They don't have the same history, for example. One of them was a full cat and has lost its tail, whereas the other has always been lacking in tail. And so you might say, okay, what is the relationship between Tibbles and Tib here? Are they actually the same cat? Does that mean that even though the two objects that have different histories can actually be identical? That seems weird. That seems like you could have things that are identical and yet have different characteristics. There's ways there's ways you can maneuver your way out of it. Maybe you can somehow say, Tib never existed. What are you talking about? Tail complement. But again, if we want to accept that things have parts, you're going to have to sort of account for why Tib wasn't a real thing. You could say that maybe Tib disappears the moment that Tibbles loses his tail, because that's the moment where they become exactly identical. But then again, why did this part sort of poof when something changed to the whole? So again, there's ways you can address this. None of them are going to be fully satisfactory or fully intuitive. Here's another version of the same kind of problem. Again, we got a cat on the mat. Let's say it's Tibbles again. Now, Tibbles has got, let's say, I don't know, 50,000 hairs. I don't know how many hairs cats have. Now, we can, just like we did with the tail complement, right? We can take the cat that coincides with Tibbles, but except for one of the hairs. And you can do that conceptually for all of the hairs. So now, we've got, let's say, Tibbles with all the hairs. There's the version of Tibbles missing this hair. There's the version of Tibbles missing this hair. There's the version of Tibbles missing this hair. They all share the same space, right? Are they all the same cat? Fine. If that's the case, what is that cat? Is it like an average of all of these cats? Or if you want to say that the versions missing a hair don't count, then again, what's our idea about parts then? We get to the similar, it's a sort of similar version of the same problem. It doesn't seem to be a very easy way out of it. One more problem about identity, the symmetrical spheres. So imagine that you have a universe that has only 3 exactly identical spheres in it. There's nothing else in this universe. Just 3 spheres. They're made up of exactly the same material. And they are equidistant from each other. All 3 of them are equidistant from each other. Okay? So now we have these 3 spheres that in every respect are identical, right? Even in the respect of sort of spatial relationships, right? Because there's nothing else in this universe. So there's nothing else, so now you can say, well, the sphere is over there and this sphere is over there, right? Because in this universe, there's actually nothing else besides these 3 spheres. And so given that the concept of direction is relative, these are the only objects that we can have direction relative to. So even in that respect, these spheres are entirely identical. And so if you want to say that the spheres are different, they're not actually the same object, you're going to have to say that it's the case that you can have distinct objects even though they share all characteristics. Again, maybe there's ways out of this. Maybe there's just a characteristic of being sort of itself that the others, I guess they are also themselves, but have distinctly. Maybe there's ways out of it, but it's not going to be easy. So let me bring this all now back to the law of identity itself, which is just a law that says that anything is itself, right? Let's put it as A is A. The examples that I gave, I think show something fairly clearly, which is that our notion of what a distinct object is, and our notion of equivalence, of identity with, are not actually super clear or unproblematic. Okay, just what counts as the cat on the mat, and what counts as being identical with the cat on the mat. Not very clear, right? And so with regard to the law of identity, A is A, if we are not 100% sure what constitutes the actual object that is A, and we're not super clear on what is, in this context is equivalency, right? Identity fully means or entails, then can we really say that we are 100% sure, no shadow of a doubt left open, that that A is a universal rule? I don't think we can. How can we say that we're 100% sure about something that we aren't even fully clear about the meaning of? And so that's my basic case for why I do think there is doubt to be introduced about the law of identity. Let me be clear. This is a good time to sort of reiterate a really important point. I'm talking about epistemology here. I'm not talking about metaphysics, right? So I do think that the law of identity is true. I do think it probably makes sense to say it's universal. It applies to everything. And even that you could know that a priori. I'm merely saying that even though all of that is true, we can't know it with 100% certainty. We have to leave in some room for doubt given all of the considerations that have just been brought up. Now, this allows for a good segue into the other kind of sort of logical certainty claims, which are the ones about analyticity, right? Just the meanings of the words, that's all that's sort of under question. And so let me actually give everybody's favorite. 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? How could you possibly have doubt about that? Well, I mean, I sort of bring back some of the stuff that I was just saying about identity, right? Do we actually know what we mean when we say 2, the number 2, right? I mean, in a sense, we know how to use the word 2. We know how to count. We know how to apply it to all kinds of things. But what actually is 2? There's this whole debate about the nature of mathematical objects. Are they real in some sense? If they are real, what does that reality consist of? What does it mean to be a real abstract object? Are they actually mental objects? Are they really just, concepts? Or do they not exist at all other than just in our descriptions? What would be the difference between all of those claims? Those are really, really controversial issues on which there's absolutely no clear answer. And so again, how can we actually say we are sure with 100% certainty that 2 plus 2 equals 4 if we don't even know what those terms actually refer to, what their ontology consists of? Maybe you want to say, okay, well, I put the ontology aside. Can't we be 100% sure that whatever numbers are, 2 plus 2 equals 4? I mean, all you've done there is really just push the problem aside, right? Because you have to say whatever numbers are, 2 plus 2 equals 4. But, now you've got the word numbers in there and you're more or less admitting that we're not actually clear about what that is. And so again, we've got this sort of sentence with a term that we can't even be, we're not even sort of confident that we know what it is. So how can we really say we're 100% sure of the truth value of the claim? And so this will apply, to forget bachelors or unmarried men, even just bachelors are bachelors, right? What are bachelors? Pick a bachelor. We could do the same. We can have the same problem with that bachelor that we had with Tibbles, okay? Which means again, yeah, of course, bachelors are bachelors, right? But we're not gonna allow a 0.001% chance of error, given that we can't even come to a coherent and clear answer to the question of what a given thing is, whatever it is, bachelor or whatever else. It seems like we have to allow for that uncertainty, given how difficult it is to have an account of just objects. Here's a different example that still, I think, more or less falls in the analyticity umbrella. Maybe not quite, but whatever umbrella it falls in, here it is. The Preface paradox. Okay, so the Preface paradox says, look, I'm going to say that every claim that I've made in these 2 episodes about certainty, I believe are true. And that is true, even though I'm not certain of any of them. I do think that I do for all of my claims that I've made, I think were true. That's why I made them. However, I also, pretty confident, must have made a mistake somewhere. There's probably some claim that I made that's actually just wrong. So, what does this mean? It means that I believe for each of my claims that they are true. And yet I believe that their conjunction, okay, that is, if you just sort of put all of the claims that I've made and put the word "and" in between all of them, that big statement, that is the anding, conjunction of all of them, I don't think that that's true. I think there's got to be one in there that's going to be false, and so it's going to make the whole conjunction false. Okay, so doesn't it follow from the simple meaning of the word "and" that if I believe each of the things that I've said, that I must believe their conjunction? Isn't that just what "and" means? Seems like it, but I'm also pretty confident that I have made a mistake. And yet I do believe each of the things that I've said. Okay, so this is the Preface paradox. Again, no easy solution to it. And it seems to fly in the face of our simple understanding of the word "and." Okay, so just another sort of place where something as simple as just, hey, it's just the meaning of the terms, allows for some doubt to be called into it. So at this point, I want to now make some kind of like concluding arguments against certainty. These are no longer quite in the logical realm. Now I'm just sort of wrapping up my whole against certainty claim with a few general problems. Don't quite apply to experience or logic. These are sort of general, or some extra general reasons to think we probably shouldn't think we're 100% certain of anything. One is a historical critique, right? So logic. So let's say let's kind of take as the example the logical claims to certainty that we've been talking about. Logic is a field that developed historically, right? Aristotle basically was the first person to identify it as a field of study and establish it. And then, some people made contributions along the way. There was a big, revolution in the 19th century about with logic, and then some more changes were added on later. All of this stuff contingent, right? So we kind of have this idea of logic as this sort of holy special thing, but our actual understanding of things like the laws of it are things that developed contingently. And intuitively, it seems that things that develop contingently have room for error. There's just a general argument there. Another general argument is just the possibility that meaning itself is an illusion. Okay, so here's a possible way that things might be. Here's a possible world. There's a possible world in which creatures just like us develop, and let's say just through evolutionary imperatives, they develop to have this feeling that things make sense, and that they use this language that creates meaning, and that they put meanings together in a way that's sort of incontrovertible and allows them to use this thing called reason to make sense of things. And that all of that is just a subjective feeling, that the creatures that have that feeling tend to do better, and so there's this evolutionary imperative for that feeling to develop. But in actual fact, there's no actual connection between these sort of things that they're thinking. These are sort of like cognitive splitterings that these creatures go through, and it's just part of those cognitive splitterings that they feel like they really go well together in these necessary ways. But all of that is just nonsense. Okay, so if that's true, then everything I've been saying is just nonsense, right? I've just been making sounds, and that's all we are doing, and we are sort of, we pass along social cues to each other by making sounds, but there's no actual sense or meaning to them. I'm not saying that's true. I don't think that we can believe that that's true, because if we believe that that's true, then we're right away saying that our beliefs don't make sense, including that one. That's what I spoke to Professor Jim Slagle about in my interview with him. So I don't think we can actually believe that, but I think we have to accept that it is a possibility, right? There's nothing sort of contradictory about that being the case. There's something contradictory about us believing it, but it's perfectly possible, right? There certainly is a possible world where that's the case. And so just because, given that that is in fact possible, right? Physically, metaphysically, it's all possible. I think it follows that we can't say we're 100% certain that we know anything, because it could always be that skepticism ends up actually being true. And, if it were, we wouldn't know it. It's just part of our illusion that it seems to us like it's not. So again, another general case against certainty. Another kind of evolutionary critique. So this one not so pessimistic and skeptical. So presumably reason, logic are things that have developed through evolutionary processes. We kind of adapt over time to develop stronger norms about reasoning and argumentation and entailment and all that good stuff. And presumably, we're not done with that process, right? Why would we think that we're done with that process? We're probably, at just some point in the middle of it. Maybe relatively early on, maybe relatively late, depends on the fate of our species, I suppose. But whatever the answer is, most likely we'll continue to progress. And some of that progress may involve major revolutions that end up having us rethink everything that we thought we knew, in such a way where it may end up we may end up discovering that everything we thought we knew, while maybe true in a sense, or useful to us the way we were using it then, for some maybe a technical reason, let's say, was actually all false. Maybe because our basic, there were flaws in our basic language, right? To kind of go back to that idea that, can we really be sure about claims where we aren't even sure about identifying the objects in the claim? Maybe for reasons like that, or for other reasons, we may end up discovering that there are sort of inconsistencies, incoherencies, incoherent things in our language or our logic that will make us realize, actually, there was a way in which everything we used to believe was wrong, right? I mean, and we've seen that, for example, in physics, right? So the developments in physics in the 20th century have shown us that there was a way in which what we thought we knew when we were using Newtonian physics was actually wrong. It was very useful. It was very close to the truth. There was a sense in which it was correct. But, literally speaking, we now view that as actually wrong, right? And so that may end up happening with logic and reasoning as well. Another reason to think that we shouldn't be 100% certain. A couple more. Issue of grounding, right? So to discuss logic, to talk about things like logical laws and norms about entailment and stuff like that, we need to take some of that stuff for granted. It's impossible to do any reasoning without taking some of it for granted. Okay, which means that there's a sense in which we can't ever actually question it, to court, right? Because we're always going to have to take some part of it for granted. That also would seem to show that we got to leave some room for doubt there, right? Because our justification can't hit a kind of bottom level when it comes to discussion about logic. There's also a kind of praxeological problem, okay? So if you claim to be 100% certain about something, 100% certain, it's literally inconceivable to you that you could be wrong. It is metaphysically, logically impossible, according to you, that you could be wrong. Then there's an important sense in which you're not actually open to the possibility that you could be wrong, right? Which means that, let's say you were listening to this or watching this, you have not actually considered the possibility that I might be right. Okay, which means you haven't given me an actual opportunity to convince you. Don't worry, I'm not taking it personally. But there's a way in which you've sort of violated a norm of discourse by doing that, right? So when we engage in things like debate, discourse, argumentation, part of the norm, part of the social normativity of discourse is that we allow for the possibility of being convinced by the other person. So to claim 100% certainty about something is, in effect, to performatively block off that possibility. It's actually to say about something, I'm not actually willing to engage in open dialogue with you. I'm not willing to hear what you might have to say that might be in opposition to that. That is in practice what you're doing. Now, if you don't do that, right? If you say, sure, I'll hear what you have to say, then right there, you've opened up the possibility for doubt. Otherwise, you're pretending and you're not actually really listening and considering this. So in terms of just the terms of how debate works, it kind of follows that you're going to have room for doubt, allow for room for doubt about anything. Otherwise, they're just things you're not willing to talk about. Okay, so that actually does wrap up everything I have to say on this topic. So here's my final sort of thought. Is there anything that you can still say you're 100% sure about without any sliver of doubt, given all of the arguments that I made? In other words, are you really 100% sure without a sliver of a doubt that none of the arguments that I've made, not a single one of them, was enough to introduce even a teeny bit of doubt into all of your propositions? Now, let's say your answer to that is still yes. Your answer to that is, is still, yeah, there's still something I'm certain about, regardless of everything you've said. let's say that you say, yeah, I don't care that there's all these controversies and lack of consensus on all of these matters in ontology and logic and all this good stuff. I don't care. I know the answers, and I don't mind being in the minority. I know what the answers are. I can see why they're necessary, and so yes, I'm certain, 100% certain. Even if that's the case, right? Even if you feel certain about all of those things, and your reasons aren't bad, and you're actually right about all of them, my claim is that you still, given everything that I've said, given all of these sort of different reasons, for you to claim that you are justified in believing that your justification is 100% foolproof, you just don't have that. I don't have the reason to be able to do that, right? You're not actually justified in that extra level claim of foolproofness, even if you believe it. I'm going to leave off with that and say, even if that is in fact how you sort of feel, and even if you end up being right, you are still not actually 100% certain. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, I'll make a case for anarchism by discussing the Stanford Prison Experiment and social ontology. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.